At 1:47 in the morning, someone cut the camera. Not a power surge, not a technical fault, a deliberate, calculated disconnection. Whoever did it knew exactly where that camera was mounted, and they came prepared to silence it before stepping into its frame. Within the next 41 minutes, 2 more systems went dark in sequence. And by the time the sun came up over Tucson, Arizona, an 84-year-old woman was gone. No ransom call, no note, no trace visible to the naked eye. Just a house that looked exactly like someone had stepped out for a moment and never came back. What followed would become one of the most scrutinized missing persons cases in recent American history. And what was done to the people closest to this woman, in the name of finding the truth, is a story that needs to be told just as much as the crime itself. Before we go any further, this case contains details that some viewers may find disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. If you are new here, welcome to True Crime Exposed. Hit that subscribe button right now. We cover cases like this with facts, not rumors. Drop a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from. And if this is the kind of coverage you have been looking for, like this video and share it. Let us get into it. Before you can understand what was taken, you have to understand who was taken. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She lived alone in the Catalina foothills, one of Tucson's quieter residential neighborhoods, tucked against the base of the Santa Catalina Mountains in southern Arizona. She was not a woman who had retreated from life. She was sharp, active, and deeply rooted in the rhythms of her daily world. She had her routines, her community, and a faith she practiced every single Sunday morning without fail through a virtual church service she joined from her home. That Sunday morning service was not a small detail. It was as reliable as clockwork. The people who shared that virtual space with her knew her face in that little square on the screen the way you know a neighbor's porch light. When it was on, everything was fine. When it went dark, something was wrong. Nancy had 3 adult children. Her eldest daughter, Savannah Guthrie, is one of the most recognizable faces in American morning television, a co-anchor of NBC's Today Show, a position she has held since 2012. Her second daughter is Annie Guthrie, who lived in Tucson with her husband, Tommaso Cioni. Her son Cameron Guthrie rounds out the family. All 3 were present in Nancy's life in real, consistent ways. This was not a family that existed only in holiday phone calls. They were close, genuinely close. The kind of closeness that comes from proximity and intention, not obligation. Annie and Tommaso's home was approximately 10 minutes from Nancy's house in the Catalina foothills. 10 minutes is close enough that a family dinner does not require weeks of calendar coordination. It is close enough to drop something off on the way home. Close enough that seeing each other regularly was simply part of how life worked. Nancy was not on the edge of her family's world. She was at the center of it. Inside her home, Nancy had 2 pieces of technology that would later become central to everything investigators worked with. The first was a doorbell camera mounted at her front entrance. The second was a cardiac pacemaker implanted in her chest, a device that did not simply regulate her heart. It was connected in real time to a monitoring application linked directly to her physicians. It transmitted data continuously. As long as Nancy was within range of the phone she kept at home, that device was quietly broadcasting confirmation that her heart was still beating. Both pieces of technology will matter enormously to this story, but that comes later. On the evening of January 31st, 2026, Nancy did what she had done many times before. She went to Annie and Tommaso's home for dinner and a game night. She did not drive herself. She took an Uber. That is a small detail that says something real about who she was. At 84, She made the practical choice to let someone else drive without it meaning she needed anyone to manage her life. Independent, but grounded in good judgment. When the evening ended, Tommaso drove Nancy home. At 9:48 p.m., the garage door at Nancy's house rose. She stepped inside. At 9:50 p.m., the garage door came back down. Tommaso sat in the driveway and watched it close. Then he pulled away into the night. The neighborhood went quiet. That was the last confirmed visual record of Nancy Guthrie inside her home. The neighborhood was quiet. The garage door was down. And somewhere in the darkness of that early February morning, someone was already moving. At 1:47 a.m., the doorbell camera at Nancy's front entrance went offline. Not because of a power outage. Not because of a dead battery or a technical glitch. It was disconnected. Deliberately. By someone who arrived at that property in the middle of the night already knowing the camera was there. Already knowing where it was mounted, and already carrying whatever they needed to silence it before stepping into its frame. Think about what that requires. You do not disable a specific camera at a specific location on a specific night by accident. You have to have seen it. You have to have studied it. You have to have stood close enough to that house on a prior occasion to know exactly what you were dealing with. This was not a crime of impulse. This was the execution of a plan that had been assembled in advance, probably over days, possibly over weeks. Someone had been watching Nancy Guthrie's home long before January 31st. But here is where the plan started to come apart. Even though the camera had been taken offline, even though Nancy did not have an active cloud recording subscription running on that device, digital forensic specialists working the case were later able to extract residual data from the system's back-end architecture. Data that kept logging even after the live feed went dark. Fragments, movement signals, electronic footprints embedded in the infrastructure of the system itself. And at 2:12 a.m., that residual data registered movement near the home. The perpetrator had believed they erased themselves completely from the record the moment they cut that camera. They had not. The system they thought they had silenced was still watching in ways they did not anticipate. 16 minutes later, at 2:28 a.m., the second system went dark. Nancy's cardiac pacemaker, the device in her chest transmitting real-time data to a monitoring application connected to her physicians, stopped sending its signal. The transmission did not fail. It did not malfunction. It went offline in a way that forensic analysis determined was most consistent with Nancy being physically moved out of range of the phone she had left behind inside the house. That pacemaker was designed to tell the world her heart was still beating as long as she remained near that phone. When the signal dropped, it meant she was no longer near it. It meant she had been taken out of that house. 3 systems across 41 minutes. The doorbell camera at 1:47. The motion data window at 2:12. The pacemaker signal at 2:28. Each one going dark in sequence. That is not coincidence. That is a timeline. Someone moved through that property with a clear understanding of what each system recorded and made deliberate choices to neutralize them one by one. The camera first, then the movement through the property, then the removal of Nancy herself. And when investigators examined the physical scene, what they found confirmed everything the electronic record suggested. The rear access points of the home had been propped open. Not broken, not forced, propped deliberately, held open using Nancy's own flower pots, objects taken from inside her home and repositioned to keep an exit route clear and accessible. Whoever did this did not rush. They opened the back, secured it, and gave themselves a clean path out. They were operating on a schedule they had mapped before they ever arrived. On the front porch, investigators recovered biological material. DNA analysis later confirmed it belonged to Nancy Guthrie. The following afternoon, on Sunday, February 1st, Nancy's virtual church service began without her. The square on the screen where her face should have been was empty. Her friends noticed immediately. They called. No answer. They called again. Nothing. They reached the family. And at 11:56 a.m., family members arrived at Nancy's house. What they found stopped them cold. Nancy's phone was inside. Her purse was inside. Every personal item an 84-year-old woman does not leave behind by choice was exactly where it would be if she'd had no say in the matter. At 12:03 p.m., the family called 911. Deputies arrived at 12:15 p.m. And the moment law enforcement began reading that scene, the nature of this case became undeniable. By February 2nd, it was official. Law enforcement confirmed publicly that Nancy Guthrie had been removed from her home against her will. By February 5th, the FBI released footage recovered from the doorbell camera's back-end data. The image showed an individual standing at Nancy's front entrance in the early hours of February 1st, face completely covered, backpack on, a firearm visibly on their person, moving with deliberate, unhurried purpose through a property they clearly knew. That individual has never been identified, never named, never found, and yet within 48 hours of that footage going public, the internet had already stopped looking at them. This investigation pulled in some of the most powerful law enforcement agencies in the country. What they found in the forensic data will change how you see this case entirely. If you are not subscribed to True Crime Exposed yet, hit that button right now. This is exactly the kind of coverage we bring to every single case we cover, and you do not want to miss what comes next. From the moment deputies arrived at Nancy Guthrie's home on the afternoon of February 1st, this was never treated as a routine missing persons case. The physical evidence at the scene, combined with what the electronic systems had already recorded, pointed investigators in a clear and serious direction from day one. And the response that followed matched the gravity of what the evidence was showing. The Pima County Sheriff's Department took primary jurisdiction over the investigation on the ground. They coordinated scene processing, managed the search operations across the surrounding terrain, and handled the public-facing communications as the case developed. Working alongside them was the Federal Bureau of Investigation, whose involvement brought laboratory-level forensic capabilities, behavioral analysis resources, and the kind of institutional reach that a case of this complexity demanded. Customs and Border Protection also entered the picture, given Tucson's geographic position and the possibility that whoever took Nancy may have had access to routes that crossed or ran close to the southern border corridor. Regional search teams were deployed across the Catalina foothills and the surrounding desert terrain, covering ground methodically as investigators worked to establish where Nancy may have been taken after she left her home. Among the journalists covering this case, one name separated itself from the rest almost immediately. Brian Entin, senior national correspondent for NewsNation, arrived in Tucson and stayed. While other national media rotated in and out as the news cycle demanded, Entin remained on the ground, stationed outside Nancy's home, attending press conferences and building sourcing relationships inside the investigation that no other reporter in the country was able to replicate. His credibility in this space was already established. He had covered the Gabby Petito disappearance case in 2021, a case that also generated enormous national attention, and his reporting on that investigation shaped how the public understood its most critical developments. In Tucson, he brought that same methodical, source-driven approach to Nancy's case. His role in this story will become central later. For now, understand who he is and what his presence on the ground represented. Forensic investigators were working with three primary data sources in the early stages. The back-end data recovered from the doorbell camera system gave them the residual movement signals and the precise timestamp of the disconnection. The pacemaker records provided a medically and forensically significant endpoint, the exact moment Nancy's signal dropped, and what that drop indicated about her physical location relative to the phone inside her house. And the property scene itself, the propped rear access points, the biological material on the front porch, the positioning of objects inside the home, all of it was processed for trace evidence including fibers, hair, soil transfer, and fingerprints. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos confirmed publicly that investigators had recovered DNA from the scene that did not belong to Nancy or anyone in her family. Unknown DNA. Foreign to the household. That sample was submitted for analysis at the FBI laboratory level, a designation that indicates both the seriousness of the case and the sophistication of the processing being applied to the evidence. As of the time of this video, that DNA has not been publicly matched to any known individual. 8 minutes after Nancy's pacemaker signal went offline at 2:28 a.m., a vehicle was captured on a neighbor's Ring camera passing through the area at 2:36 a.m. The timing places it in the immediate window of Nancy's removal from the property. That vehicle has not been publicly identified. Its make, model, and occupants remain unknown in the official public record. Former FBI Assistant Director John Miller, who provided analysis on the case for national media, assessed the perpetrator's profile in terms that pointed consistently in one direction. This was not someone who stumbled onto Nancy Guthrie's property by chance. The level of preparation involved, the knowledge of the camera placement, the understanding of her routines, the timing of the entry relative to when she returned home from family dinners. All of it indicated specific and detailed local knowledge. Not the kind of general familiarity someone develops by passing through an area. The kind that comes from watching, from learning a target's patterns over time, from knowing that on the night of January 31st, an 84-year-old woman would arrive home around 10 p.m., the garage would close, and the neighborhood would go dark. Retired Pima County Lieutenant Bob Krieger contributed a ground-level dimension to that profile that is worth understanding clearly. Krieger conducted searches of the desert washes and dry riverbeds that run through the Catalina foothills near Nancy's property. These are natural drainage channels that cut through the terrain and run close enough to the neighborhood that someone who knew them could move through the area in total darkness without being visible from the street. Krieger was direct about what that means. Navigating those washes at night is not something you do without prior knowledge of the terrain. You would have to be very familiar with this area. That assessment, coming from a man who spent nearly 3 decades operating in that exact geography, reinforced from a completely different angle what Miller had already established. Whoever did this knew the ground they were working on. And that brings us to Annie Guthrie's vehicle. In the early days of the investigation, Annie Guthrie's blue Honda CR-V was seized and impounded by the Pima County Sheriff's Department. It was not inspected at the curb and returned. It was taken into law enforcement custody and held there for weeks. To understand what that actually meant requires listening to the people qualified to explain it rather than the people motivated to misrepresent it. Retired FBI Special Agent Jennifer Coffindaffer addressed the vehicle seizure directly, and her explanation reframes it entirely. Investigators may have held that car to determine whether someone had placed a tracking device on it prior to the night of January 31st. Consider what that means in the context of everything else the evidence was showing. If the perpetrator had been surveilling Nancy, learning her routines, and tracking when she would be at Annie's house and when she would be heading home, Monitoring Annie's vehicle would have given them almost everything they needed. Annie drove that route. Annie was at that dinner. A device placed on her car without her knowledge could have told the perpetrator exactly when Nancy would be dropped home and when the garage door would come down for the last time that night. The car was not seized as evidence against Annie. It may have been secured as evidence that Annie's own vehicle was used against her mother without her knowledge. Retired Lieutenant Bob Krieger confirmed the broader forensic reasoning independently. In any serious abduction investigation, every vehicle connected to the victim's last known movements gets secured before evidence degrades. A modern vehicle is a rolling data archive. Location history, speed records, door open and close timestamps, sensor logs, and physically, it can carry trace evidence including fibers, soil, and hair. Securing the vehicle is methodology. It is how investigators build cases that survive scrutiny in a courtroom. The name on the registration tells you nothing about why it was taken. By March 2026, Annie's car had been processed and returned to her family. That detail received a fraction of the public attention the seizure had generated. The reward fund for information leading to Nancy's location had by this point climbed past $1 million. It remained unclaimed. Every forensic thread in this investigation, the unknown DNA, the unidentified vehicle, the perpetrator profile assembled by Miller and Krieger, the terrain knowledge required to move through the Catalina foothills in darkness, pointed toward an outside actor with deep local familiarity and deliberate preparation. Not one of those threads led back to a family dinner. But that is not where the public conversation was going. While investigators worked the evidence, something else was building online, and it was pointed in an entirely different direction. The FBI released the doorbell camera footage on February 5th. An armed masked figure standing at the front entrance of an 84-year-old woman's home in the middle of the night. Face covered, firearm visible. The image was clear enough to generate leads. It was specific enough to be actionable. And within 48 hours of it going public, a significant portion of the online conversation had already moved past it entirely. By February 4th, just 72 hours after Nancy was confirmed to have been taken against her will, the internet had identified its suspects. And they were not the masked stranger in that footage. They were Nancy Guthrie and her husband, Tommaso Cioni. The foundation of the entire theory rested on three facts. Annie and Tommaso were the last people to see Nancy before she was taken. Tommaso drove her home that night, and Tommaso watched the garage door close before pulling away. That was it. That was the complete evidentiary basis on which thousands of strangers constructed an elaborate case for family involvement. No documents. No verified disclosures. No information released by law enforcement pointing in that direction. Just proximity. Just the simple geographic and relational fact of being the last people in the room before something terrible happened. Proximity became motive. A driveway became a crime scene. A son-in-law driving his mother-in-law home after a family dinner became a sequence of actions that strangers decided they were qualified to dissect frame by frame. How long did he sit in that driveway before pulling away? Did he glance back at the house? Was his posture at the press conferences too controlled? Not emotional enough? Too composed? The analysis was endless, and the standard was designed to be impossible to meet. Because when the conclusion has already been written, every piece of evidence either confirms it or becomes suspicious for failing to confirm it loudly enough. Reddit threads multiplied. Facebook groups dedicated to the theory grew into communities with thousands of members. Content creators with no investigative access, no sourcing, no connection to anyone inside the case, began producing long, confident videos presenting speculation as reporting and rumor as fact. The algorithm rewarded certainty. Engagement climbed. Audiences grew. And the more that happened, the more content followed, because the incentive structure of the platform punished nuance and rewarded conviction. Annie and Tommaso said nothing publicly throughout all of it. No statements, no press conferences, no social media responses addressing the accusations. They appeared alongside Savannah and Cameron in family communications focused entirely on finding Nancy. They were described by law enforcement as fully cooperative, handing over everything that was asked of them. And they absorbed the accusations in silence, not because they had no answer, but because there was no platform available to them that the same ecosystem could not immediately twist into new material. And then a moment arrived that the theory seized on with particular force. Pima County Sergeant Aaron Cross, who also serves as president of the Pima County Deputies Organization, sat down with Brian Entin on Entin's channel for an interview. During that conversation, Entin asked Cross about the family's public position. Savannah Guthrie had stated publicly, including in an interview with Hoda Kotb, that the family made clear from the beginning that Nancy could not have simply wandered away from her home. Cross said something that appeared to directly contradict that. His words were that the information he had gathered indicated the family believed Nancy had walked away, that she had walked away on her own. That statement traveled fast. It was clipped, shared, and embedded into every existing theory as confirmation of a contradiction the internet had been waiting for. But Cross later issued a correction. He contacted Parade magazine and clarified that he had made an error. What he had actually meant to convey was that the family initially thought Nancy may have been voluntarily taken to a hospital, not that she had wandered away independently. An honest misstatement from an officer who got his details crossed in a live interview, or a revealing slip that was walked back under pressure. The public record does not support the second reading, but corrections rarely travel as far as the original statement. The retraction got a fraction of the attention the original claim received, and the theory absorbed the first version and quietly discarded the second. That episode illustrates something important about why the Pima County Sheriff's Office became increasingly tight in its public communications as the case wore on. Every imprecise word spoken in public by any member of law enforcement was recorded, clipped, and folded into competing narratives within hours. A sergeant's offhand misstatement in a live interview became a load-bearing pillar of an online theory before the day was out. The office was not being secretive out of evasiveness. It was responding rationally to an environment where a single imprecise sentence could do months of damage to real people who had done nothing wrong. On April 6, 2026, Savannah Guthrie returned to the Today Show for the first time since her mother's disappearance. She sat in her chair, looked into the camera, and said good morning. She said it was good to be home. The internet dissected even that. How could she return to work? How could she sit there and deliver a broadcast while her mother was still missing? But ask the honest question. What would the alternative have served? Savannah's presence on that desk was the single most powerful tool the family had to keep Nancy's name in the national conversation. Every morning she appeared on that broadcast, millions of viewers were reminded that an 84-year-old woman was still out there. Stepping away from that platform would not have brought Nancy home. It would have removed the most visible reminder that the search was still active. Then came the official record, stated plainly and in writing. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos issued a formal written statement clearing the Guthrie family. Not an offhand remark at a press conference. A written declaration under the authority of his office. His words stated that the Guthrie family, to include all siblings and spouses, had been cleared as possible suspects. He described the family as cooperative and gracious and identified them as victims. And then he did something law enforcement almost never does in a written statement. He made a moral judgment. He used the word cruel to describe what was being done to them online. Sheriffs do not typically reach past the evidence and editorialize in writing about social media behavior. When one does, it carries specific weight. It means the situation had become serious enough that the person responsible for the investigation felt compelled to say something beyond the facts. The language of that statement was also precise in a way that mattered. To include all siblings and spouses. That construction was not accidental. It extended the clearance explicitly to every member of the family, including Tommaso Cioni, the person sitting at the center of the online theory. Every one of them. Cleared. Former SWAT officer Chad Ace added another layer when he reported on national broadcast that all members of the immediate Guthrie family had reportedly passed polygraph examinations. Every one of them, including Tommaso. The official record was unambiguous. The sheriff in writing. The polygraphs. The forensic explanation for the car. Every formal and credible data point pointed in the same direction, away from the family, and toward a perpetrator who was still unidentified and still free. And still the content kept publishing. Still the threads kept running. Because by that point the theory was no longer functioning as a theory. It had become a product with an audience, and audiences are harder to walk back than conclusions. The most credible reporter on this entire case was asked directly about Annie and Tommaso. What he said in response was one sentence. And it should have ended the conversation overnight. Subscribe to True Crime Exposed right now because what comes next is the part that reframes everything. Before you weigh what Brian Entin said about this family, you need to understand what kind of reporter was doing the talking. Entin is a senior national correspondent for NewsNation who has worked some of the most high-profile disappearance cases in recent American history. He spent 7 weeks camped outside the home of Brian Laundrie after Gabby Petito went missing in 2021. He was on the ground for the Idaho student murders in 2022. He has built a career not on proximity to press conferences, but on proximity to the actual ground where something happened. In the Nancy Guthrie case, that meant Tucson. It meant the Catalina Foothills neighborhood. It meant months of sourced, embedded reporting that no national outlet came close to matching. Entin was the reporter who obtained footage of the blood spatter on Nancy's front doorstep. He was present early enough to hear sheriffs on the scene confirm blood had been found before any official statement was released. That is not a commentator working from a desk. That is a journalist who had positioned himself inside the story. As the case passed its 100th day, Entin publicly pushed back against Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos, who had stated that law enforcement was making clear progress toward finding Nancy. Entin disputed that framing. He acknowledged openly that there might be information he did not have access to. But he was direct, from his sources on the ground. He did not get the sense that investigators were getting much closer. That is a reporter willing to contradict the official position of the law enforcement agency running the investigation. That is independence operating in public, on the record, with his name attached. Which is exactly why what he said next carries the weight that it does. In May 2026, Entin was asked directly about Annie Guthrie and Tommaso Cioni. After 3 months embedded in Tucson, after developing sources inside the investigation that no other national reporter had cultivated, after challenging the sheriff's optimism in front of an audience, he was asked point-blank whether the family was involved. His answer was one sentence. He had never seen any evidence that anyone in the family was involved. Read that carefully. Not that nothing had been confirmed publicly yet. Not that he was waiting on more information. Not that tips were still being evaluated. Present tense. Complete. And then he added that the sheriff had made clear the family was not suspects, that they had been cleared, and that he goes on that conclusion. From a reporter who had openly contradicted that same sheriff elsewhere in the same news cycle, that sentence is not deference to authority. It is independent confirmation. He also said he felt bad for Annie and Tommaso. That watching them get raked over the coals on the internet while dealing with the disappearance of Nancy, Annie's own mother, was, in his words, pretty terrible. That is not the language of a reporter hedging. That is a human being who had watched innocent people absorb punishment they did not earn. Entin had also reached out to Annie and Tommaso directly, attempting to secure an interview. He had not heard back, and that silence, when understood in full context, was the only rational response available to them. Every public statement they made became material for the ecosystem feeding off their names. Every appearance became evidence to be analyzed for emotional incorrectness. Silence was not guilt. Silence was the only door that could not be kicked open and turned into content. What an statement actually exposed was not the family. It was the gap between what the speculation industry had been publishing for 3 months and what the evidence actually showed. 3 months of sourced reporting. Sources inside the investigation. A track record of challenging official narratives. And not a thread, not a document, not a single credible tip pointing toward anyone who shared Nancy Guthrie's last name or slept in the same house as someone who did. That gap, once named, pointed somewhere specific. It pointed back to the figure that the speculation industry had been actively looking away from for the entirety of those 3 months. The armed masked person on that porch. The one with a firearm. The one whose face has never been shown. The one who was still out there, still unidentified, still free, while the internet spent its energy building cases against people the sheriff had cleared in writing and a credible reporter had confirmed with 3 months of his life. Here is what the record shows. As of the time this documentary was produced, the Pima County Sheriff's Department issued its first official case statement in more than 2 weeks on June 2, 2026. Forensic testing, DNA analysis, and review of home security footage were described as ongoing. The intruder has not been publicly identified. Investigators continue urging anyone with information to come forward. The FBI is analyzing mixed DNA recovered from Nancy's home. The reward currently stands at $1.2 million, combining the family's offer and the FBI's separate contribution. It remains unclaimed. The vehicle recorded passing through a back road at 2:36 in the morning, on a route that avoids major intersections and leads directly out of Nancy Guthrie's neighborhood, has never been identified. The case has been investigated as a likely homicide, though Nancy's body has not been found. Nancy Guthrie, as of the recording of this documentary, remains missing. Now consider the perpetrator assembled from every expert voice across this investigation, delivered here as a unified picture. Brian Entin, with 3 months of sourced reporting behind him, stated plainly that he always felt whoever did this was not far from Nancy's neighborhood. Not necessarily on the same street, but someone he never sensed had come from another state. Former FBI Assistant Director John Miller suggested publicly that the suspect may not be a random outsider, pointing towards someone with local knowledge of Nancy's routines, her home layout, and her vulnerability. A suspicious vehicle was documented in the area the morning before the abduction, hours in advance, on a road described by reporters on the ground as a maze at night with no street lights and street signs you cannot read in the dark. The suspect is estimated at between 5'9" and 5'10" with an average build. He carried a specific backpack. He arrived armed. He approached the front door of an 84-year-old woman's home in the middle of the night, and he did not leave without her. This was preparation. This was surveillance. This was local knowledge of terrain that investigators themselves described as disorienting after dark. This was not random. The FBI tip line is 1-800-CALL-FBI. Anonymous tips can be submitted at tips.fbi.gov. The reward is real and it is unclaimed. Here is the question this documentary leaves with you. While the internet spent 3 months constructing theories about people a sheriff cleared in writing, while content creators built audiences on names that evidence never touched, while the speculation industry ran its algorithm and collected its engagement, the person who walked onto that porch gained time. 3 months of it. The question worth sitting with is how much ground that bought them, and whether any of that ground could have been closed if the public's attention and the tips that come with it had been pointed at the right target from the beginning. This case is not closed. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you are not subscribed to True Crime Exposed, now is the moment, and turn on the notification bell, because when this case breaks, you will want to be here.